In March of 2026, the Strait of Hormuz shut down. Oil prices blew past $100 a barrel within hours, then $110, then $120. Trading screens from London to Singapore turned red and stayed that way. Insurance companies stopped writing policies for tankers anywhere near the region. Ships already en route dropped anchor and waited, burning fuel, going nowhere. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency. Canada saw gas prices jump 30% in days, and remember, Canada is one of the largest oil-producing nations on the planet. It exports crude. It has pipelines running in multiple directions, and it still took a serious hit because the global oil market does not care where your local supply comes from. When a major route goes down anywhere in the world, prices go up everywhere in the world. In Tokyo, utility companies started burning through emergency reserves. In Seoul, refineries were begging governments for special permission to buy from any supplier at any price. In New Delhi, the rupee started sliding as import costs spiked. In Brussels, European leaders convened emergency summits trying to figure out how to keep their economies from tipping into recession. In Washington, the president authorized a release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It helped at the margins. It did not fix the underlying problem. Then you turn your attention to Beijing. The lights were on, factories were running at normal capacity, high-speed trains were moving on schedule, no emergency address to the nation, no rationing announcements, no long lines at fuel stations, no panic. This did not happen by accident. It was the result of a strategy that began forming over 30 years earlier, patient, expensive, unglamorous, and almost entirely ignored by the rest of the world until the moment it mattered most. The year is 1991. A group of government officials in Beijing are watching the news. On screen, the United States military is running Operation Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf warships, airstrikes, and complete control over the sea lanes. For those officials in Beijing, it looked like a warning. The Persian Gulf supplies a significant portion of the world's oil. To get that oil out, tankers must pass through a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz, only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly the length of a marathon. And at the time, the United States Navy had near total control over what passed through it. If you depend on oil from that region and someone else controls the gate, you do not really control your own economy. Simple as that. That same year, China quietly crossed a massive line. For decades, China had produced more oil than it used, but in 1991 that flipped. China became a net oil importer, meaning it now needed more oil than it could produce at home. And the way things were trending, that gap was only going to grow bigger every single year. Then came 2003. The United States invaded Iraq. China watched a major oil-producing country get reshaped by outside military force in a matter of weeks. What had been an abstract concern suddenly felt very real. If it could happen to Iraq, it could happen to any country China depended on for energy. China's leader at the time gave this problem a name. He called it the Malacca Dilemma. Around 80% of China's imported oil had to pass through either the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca. Both were tight choke points. Both were watched by foreign navies. One disruption, one conflict, one decision made thousands of miles away by people with completely different interests, and China's economy could be starved of fuel almost overnight. That was the moment a decision was made. Not a policy paper, not a 5-year plan, a vow. China would never again let a single stretch of water hold its entire economy hostage. The first move did not happen in the Middle East. It happened somewhere much colder, much more remote, and completely out of reach of any foreign navy. Russia had enormous oil and gas deposits sitting under some of the most remote land on Earth, vast frozen wilderness, thick forests, ground that stays frozen for most of the year. Underneath all of it, some of the largest untapped energy reserves anywhere on the planet. The key insight that changed everything: you could connect the two entirely over land with a pipeline, no ocean crossing, no strait to pass through, no foreign warship anywhere near it. That pipeline is called the ESPO, the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline. It stretches thousands of miles from the Russian interior and plugs directly into northeastern China. Oil flows from Russian ground to Chinese refineries without touching a single drop of seawater. The first agreements were signed in the mid-2000s, quietly, while most of the world's attention was focused on the Middle East. The first oil started flowing in 2011. Then came expansions in 2018, 2020, and 2022, each one adding more capacity, each one strengthening the connection between Russian supply and Chinese demand. Then, in 2019, a natural gas pipeline called the Power of Siberia followed, pumping Russian gas directly into Chinese homes and factories, heating buildings, powering industrial plants, again entirely over land, again completely outside the reach of any naval blockade. Then in 2022, something happened that China could not have scripted better if it tried. Western countries placed heavy sanctions on Russia because of the war in Ukraine. European nations rushed to cut off Russian energy, and Russia suddenly had almost no major buyers left for its most valuable export. China already had the infrastructure in place. The pipes were built, the agreements were done, the technical systems were running. And with Russia now desperate for reliable revenue, China negotiated from a position of complete strength. More oil, delivered at better prices, with payments made in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars, shifting even the financial architecture of the deal away from Western influence. By 2024, Russia had become China's single largest crude oil supplier, delivering millions of barrels every day through pipelines that no blockade on Earth could stop. Find Pakistan on a map, trace your finger to its southwestern corner, to a small port town on the Arabian Sea called Gwadar. 20 years ago, almost nobody outside the immediate region had heard of it. It was a modest fishing town on a stretch of coastline that the rest of the world had largely ignored. Today, it is one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate on the planet, and China essentially built its modern infrastructure from scratch. The logic was elegant. The Strait of Hormuz sits right at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Gwadar sits just outside it on the open Arabian Sea already past the choke point. The plan: land oil tankers at Gwadar before they ever reach the strait, move that oil overland through Pakistan by road, rail, and pipeline, deliver it directly into western China through the mountain passes of the Karakoram Range. No Strait of Hormuz, no Strait of Malacca, no long, vulnerable ocean journey. In 2013, China launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC. The investment topped $62 billion, flowing into highways cutting through mountain passes, railway lines connecting cities that had never been linked before, power plants, fiber optic cables, industrial zones, and at the southern tip of it all, a deep-water port at Gwadar leased to a Chinese state-owned company for 40 years. 40 years. That is a commitment that stretches across generations of leadership, political cycles, and technological change. Beijing did not just invest in a port, they made a 4-decade commitment to the idea that this corridor would matter. Critics in Western countries spent years calling Gwadar a wasted investment, unfinished, underused, a project that looked impressive on paper, but barely functioned in reality. And some of those criticisms had real merit. There were genuine delays. Security challenges in the surrounding region created serious problems. The throughput numbers were never as high as the original projections. But here is what those critics kept missing. Strategic infrastructure is not measured by how busy it is on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It is measured by what it changes about the choices available to everyone else. Even a partially operating Gwadar fundamentally rewrites the situation. Every barrel of oil that comes ashore there is a barrel that did not have to pass through a contested strait. China spent billions building a backdoor while others spent trillions on other approaches. 2 decades later, the backdoor was open. Picture a cavern the size of a skyscraper carved directly into solid coastal rock, not a tank farm sitting in an open field, not a collection of metal cylinders visible from the road. A massive hollow space cut into the earth itself, sealed from the surface, filled floor to ceiling with crude oil. Now picture hundreds of them, spread along the Chinese coastline across multiple provinces, many of their locations never publicly disclosed. This is China's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and the scale of it is something most people outside specialized energy circles have never fully reckoned with. The United States holds roughly 700 million barrels in salt caverns along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana. The locations are documented, they appear on maps, they have been written about extensively, anyone with satellite imagery can identify them. China's combined strategic and commercial storage carries estimates as high as 1.3 billion barrels, nearly double U.S. capacity, carved into rock, harder to detect from satellites, and distributed across multiple coastal provinces so that no single event can compromise the entire system. Construction began in 2004 with the first facilities in Zhanjiang and Shandong provinces. Phase 2 followed in 2009, dramatically expanding total capacity. More phases followed through the early 2020s, each one adding to a network that kept growing while the world's attention was elsewhere. The country that can wait gets to set the terms. Every other country racing to secure supply, negotiating from desperation, accepting bad prices, China had built enough stored buffer to outlast the panic entirely. Not days, not weeks, months. Here is the number that reframes everything else in this story. Oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz now accounts for just 6.6% of China's total energy consumption. 20 years ago, that number sat close to 30%. So what happened to the other 23%? China replaced it, piece by piece, with domestic energy that no foreign government could ever threaten. In a single recent year, China installed more solar capacity than the United States has installed across its entire history. Not 1 year of Chinese growth compared to 1 year of American growth. 1 year of Chinese installation compared to every solar panel ever bolted onto a rooftop or desert facility in America since the technology was first invented. Massive wind farms stretch across the grasslands of Inner Mongolia and the high desert plateaus of Gansu and Xinjiang, turbines spinning through the night, generating electricity that powers entire provinces without burning a single drop of imported fuel. China is currently building more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined, at a pace not seen anywhere on Earth since the 1970s building boom. Each reactor that starts generating power is another chunk of energy demand that no longer needs to be met with oil from a tanker crossing a contested strait. Tens of thousands of miles of high-speed electric rail now crisscross eastern China, functionally replacing short domestic flights for hundreds of millions of passengers. Every one of those journeys runs on domestically generated electricity, not jet fuel refined from imported crude. And then the number that pulls the whole picture together, in 2024, more than half of all new cars sold in China were electric or hybrid. While debates raged in boardrooms and parliaments elsewhere about whether electric vehicles were actually ready for mainstream adoption, Chinese buyers had already answered every one of those questions with their purchasing decisions. Every electric car on a Chinese road is a vehicle that does not need gasoline. Every solar panel on a Chinese rooftop is electricity that never came from a tanker. Every wind turbine spinning in the desert is energy that was never sitting in a ship waiting to pass through a narrow strait, vulnerable to whatever happened to be going on in the Persian Gulf that week. For years, Western financial analysts called all of this wasteful, overbuilding, government distortion of the market, too many panels being manufactured, too many cars being subsidized, more capacity than the system could ever actually use. They were measuring it as an economic policy. It was never just economic, it was strategic, and March 2026 proved it. In March of 2026, the Strait of Hormuz shut down. Oil prices blew past $100 a barrel within hours. The world panicked. China did not. Russian pipelines were delivering crude on schedule overland, through terrain no naval blockade can reach. Tankers from Africa and the Middle East were unloading at Gwadar and sending cargo north through Pakistan into western China by rail. Underground caverns along the coast were sitting topped off a massive buffer standing between any disruption in global markets and the actual functioning of the Chinese economy. Tens of millions of electric cars were charging overnight from wind turbines spinning in Inner Mongolia and solar installations across Qinghai. None of it was about predicting this exact crisis on this exact date. It was about understanding 2 decades earlier that a crisis like this was always going to come eventually. The only real question was whether China would be ready when it did. Every agreement signed in the mid-2000s was working. Every billion committed at Guadar. Every cavern carved out of coastal rock. Every solar panel installed in a desert. Every electric car that rolled off a production line. None of this was a secret. The pipeline agreements were announced publicly. CPEC was covered in newspapers around the world. The strategic reserve construction was reported on by energy journalists. The renewable energy targets were published for anyone to read. Every major piece of this strategy was visible to anyone paying attention. Most people were not paying attention because it was not dramatic. It was not a conflict or a scandal or a surprise announcement. It was pipelines and caverns and solar panels. It was concrete being poured and steel being welded and press releases being filed. Infrastructure does not go viral. Two completely different ways of thinking about problems were on display in March 2026. One approach waits for a crisis to arrive and then reacts, deploys reserves, holds emergency summits, finds alternate suppliers at bad prices. The other approach looks at the crisis coming 20 years from now and starts building the solution today. Not for the politicians who make the decisions, not for the election cycle happening next year. For the country, those decisions will eventually protect long after the people who made them are out of office. While other governments cycled through 4-year terms debating the same energy security questions on repeat, China was laying pipe in Siberia, carving caverns into coastal rock, building a port at the edge of the Arabian Sea, and installing solar panels at a pace that stunned outside observers every single year. The underground caverns did not make headlines when they were being carved. The Guadar port did not trend online when construction equipment first moved in. The Espo pipeline did not break the internet when the first oil started flowing through it. But boring infrastructure done consistently over 20 years turned out to be more powerful than any dramatic move made in a moment of crisis. The most effective strategies are almost never the loudest ones.